Throughout the next 25 hours, we will keep repeating a set of verses from the Torah known as the 13 attributes of God. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum Vechanun, Erech Apayim Verav Chesed Ve'emet, Noseh Chesed La'alafim, Noseh Avon Va'fesha, Vechata'a Venakeh. The Lord, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. It's a set of beautiful verses describing a God of forgiveness and mercy, originally found in Exodus chapter 34. Yet what we read actually stops in the middle of verse 7. It continues, "Yet God does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children, upon the 3rd and 4th generations." Is this then saying that children are punished for the sins of their parents? That does not seem moral or right. How can this fit with the image of a God who forgives unto the 1,000th generation, as described in the verse I mentioned earlier? One of the early rabbis asks this exact question in Tractate Berachot of the Babylonian Talmud. An anonymous rabbi responds, "This punishment refers to those who adopt the reprehensible practices of their ancestors, while those who adopted righteous practices would be rewarded." I'm not sure that I buy that rabbi's interpretation, as it seems like a theology of reward and punishment, which doesn't match with my understanding of God. It's not a theology I trust because, as Rabbi Michal Springer put it, it has the potential to be a dangerous theology. I know it doesn't seem that way on the surface, as it implies a world of immediate justice, but the implications of the theology are troubling. When we start to think that we are rewarded or punished in this life based on our actions in this life, there is the potential to see any suffering as punishment for sin. Cancer that hits an otherwise healthy person, or someone who loses everything in a fire or flood is, according to this theology, no longer struck by the actions of random chance, but it implies that the person has sinned and is now being punished by God. We see this theology taking place now during this pandemic. People who claim that God will protect them from getting sick, or people who say that those who died from COVID are being punished, or didn't believe hard enough. While it might be simpler and more satisfying to believe that evil will be immediately punished or the righteous will be immediately rewarded, I don't want to believe that God is like an accountant who balances the good deeds and sins of our lives in the book of life. And yes, I know that we talk about being written in the book of life. But maybe the book of life isn't a ledger. Maybe it's a novel, or all of our lives coming together to create a poem that describes the whole world. I believe in a God that is more complicated than that, which leaves me back to the same problem we started with. How do we fit the image of an all-merciful God with the image of a God who punishes great-grandchildren for the actions of their great-grandparents? It was only when I stopped thinking about these verses as describing a vengeful God and started thinking about them as a parent or a teacher that I started to come up with an explanation that worked for me. When I am with my daughter or teaching, I often think in terms of natural consequences. What's the difference? According to Valia Taleb, punishment is about stopping someone from doing an action because they will receive a penalty, whether that is a fine, jail time, a timeout, or some other reaction whose only purpose is to deter and make the person suffer. Natural consequences, on the other hand, are directly related to the act and are meant to show why it's not a good idea. So natural consequences let them experience the results of their own actions. Run away while on a walk? You have to hold my hand and can't look at whatever you want. Lie to a boss about being sick? I'm sure they'll require a doctor's note the next time. It's not about punishment, because punishment rarely works. It's about letting the person see that the consequences of their actions have larger repercussions, and hoping that they'll decide to act differently in the future. So too here. God is not saying, your parents sinned, now you and your children must be punished. God is simply not stepping in to counteract the consequences, which can reverberate for generations. For example, think about climate change. The predictions started in the late last century, with predictions that by 2030, the weather and climate-related disasters would increase exponentially in both occurrence and cost, unless action was taken to combat it. Look at where we are now. The willingness to ignore that data has come home to roost. Warmer summers, more intense wildfire seasons in the western United States, more powerful hurricanes more often, more powerful storms forming violent tornadoes where they rarely used to appear, 100-year storms that happen every few years. Climate change is happening now, and as we continue to stall on taking action, the consequences grow for our children and our children's children, even unto the third and fourth generation. But to be fair, humans have a problem thinking in generational terms. We focus on short-term, achievable projects, and rarely on visions that will last for lifetimes. It's understandable that we would not want to sacrifice for something that will likely never have an effect on our lives. Yet, Judaism encourages us to recognize that, as natural as that tendency is, we can and should aspire to something more. In Tractate Ta'anit in the Babylonian Talmud, a story is told about a man named Honi. Honi was walking along a path when he encountered an old man planting a carob tree. He asked the man, "How many years will it take until it bears fruit?" The old man replied, "About 70 years. Honi laughed derisively. "You're an old man. How are you going to live another 70 years? There's no way you'll be able to eat from that tree. You're wasting your time." The man replied, "When I was born, this world was full of fully grown carob trees. Just as my ancestors planted for me, I will plant for my children and my children's children." The actions that we take have an impact on the future. And it's not enough to think about a few years from now. We have to think about generations from now. How will our actions impact the world in a century? For many of us, imagining the consequences that far in the future is not easy. And this set of verses is about so much more than just thinking about how our actions will affect the generations to come. It's also a profound psychological insight. We learn how to be human from our parents. We learn from their actions what is right and what is wrong. Their actions can lead us to define what is good and what is bad for our children and for our children's children. It is not simply how we are raised or how we raise children that has that effect. Psychologists and biologists, among others, have for years had a debate on nature versus nurture. The question is, which has more impact on who we are? Our genes and biological predispositions, or how we were raised? For decades, scientists argued as though they were two completely separate aspects of who we are. But now there is rising evidence that how we behave can have an impact on our children, not just psychologically, but physically. That our behaviors can change how our genes are expressed, and that can be inherited. That our nature and nurture are not really separate, but intertwined deeply. It would be easy for any of us to say that we have done wrong because it's how I was raised, or it's just how I was born. But Yom Kippur demonstrates Judaism's belief in free will. The very core of teshuvah is recognizing what we have done and committing to change. Judaism doesn't accept this is just who we are. Changing how we think and behave is the point of Yom Kippur. It's not impossible, just difficult. It is very much within our power, as long as we have the will to make it so. And I want to make sure you realize that as much as we sit here today and focus on what we've done wrong, today is a profoundly hopeful day. We dare to dream that we can change ourselves, that we can do teshuvah, repentance, that when put in situations where we have chosen to do wrong in the past, we will now act differently and choose right, because there is no point in an existence where all we do is focus on our imperfections or on what we have done wrong. That recognition is only a first step. Then and only then can we work to fix the harm we have done. And after that, we have to struggle to make sure that we do better in the future. Judaism is a religion that thrives on hope. We as Jews have suffered so many catastrophes that should have destroyed us. We were exiled twice from the land of Israel. We were murdered by Romans, by Crusaders, by Cossacks. We've survived attempted genocide at least twice, first with Haman in the book of Esther, and Nazi Germany more recently. We've survived literally millennia of people trying to destroy us. After all, how do we describe many Jewish holidays? They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. We Jews should be a forgotten people many times over, yet we are still here. How have we managed to survive? Because we have learned to adapt when necessary, how to hold to our beliefs, and we have learned that hope is never lost. The audacity to hope after all that we have been through is stunning. I mean, who would believe that Jews are going to somehow establish a homeland in the land of Israel after 2,000 years of exile? Or that we could survive people hurling hate at us and continue to grow? We are a people who continue to hope when all logic says we should just give up. And then, once again, our hope is given life. Our dreams are fulfilled, and we begin anew. We learn a few pages after the story of Honi in Tractate Ta'anit that there was no day as joyful for the Jewish people as Yom Kippur. That as the day ended, the sins of the entire people were forgiven. And I imagine that everyone looked forward to the rest of the year as one that could still be free of wrongdoing. A world that had the potential to be a world of goodness, of compassion, of mercy, and of justice. And as we enter into this day of Yom Kippur, let us look back and see what we have done wrong, vow to do better and fix the harm we have caused, and continue to be audacious and hopeful that we can become better people than we were the year before, and even the generation before. That our words and actions continue to be better still next year, and inspire generations after us to build a world of compassion, mercy, justice, and peace. Gemar Chatima Tova. May we all have a meaningful Yom Kippur.